Everything you were taught about history is a lie. In 1667, the Dutch government made the dumbest deal in human history, or the smartest, depending on who you ask. They owned a city, a small island off the coast of America, a swampy little colony called New Amsterdam. You know it today by a different name, Manhattan. Today, that island is worth over $2 trillion. $2 trillion. The most expensive piece of real estate on Earth. And the Dutch gave it away. They handed it to the British for free. They walked away from Manhattan forever. Why? Because they wanted something else. Something they believed was more valuable than a city. Something so precious. They were willing to commit genocide to control it. Massacre 15,000 human beings. Wipe an entire civilization off the map. And what was this thing? What was worth more than New York City? What did the smartest businessmen on Earth choose over Manhattan? This, a tiny, brown seed that's probably sitting in your kitchen right now. Nutmeg. And the reason you've never heard this story is not an accident. The truth about this spice was buried, hidden, erased from your history books on purpose. Because if you knew what the Dutch did to get nutmeg, you would never look at your spice rack the same way again. This is the real history of nutmeg. To understand why a spice was worth more than Manhattan, you have to understand something almost no one knows. For most of human history, nutmeg only grew in one place on Earth. Not Asia, not India, not even mainland Indonesia. A tiny cluster of volcanic islands in the middle of nowhere, the Banda Islands. Look on a map, find Indonesia, then look east, past Java, past Sulawesi, past every place you've ever heard of, until you reach a group of islands so small, so remote, so forgotten, that even today most people don't know they exist. That's where nutmeg comes from. 10 tiny islands. Together they cover an area smaller than the city of Paris. And on those 10 islands grew the only nutmeg trees on planet Earth. Nowhere else. Not one tree. For thousands of years. If you wanted nutmeg, you had to come here, to the edge of the known world. And the people who lived on these islands had no idea what they were sitting on. The Bandanese were a peaceful trading people. For centuries, they had a simple system. Arab and Chinese merchants would sail in, trade them silks and pottery and iron tools, take the nutmeg, and leave. The Bandanese didn't know where the nutmeg went after that. They didn't know that those small brown seeds were being traded across the world. They didn't know that by the time their nutmeg reached Europe, it was worth, and I want you to listen to this carefully, 60,000 times more than it cost them to grow it. 60,000 times. A small bag of nutmeg in London could make a man rich for life. A single pound of it cost the same as 7 fat oxen. The kings of Europe wore nutmeg around their necks like jewelry. The popes burned it as incense. The doctors of the time believed nutmeg could cure the plague. So during outbreaks, the wealthy would carry pomanders, small metal balls, stuffed with nutmeg, and breathe through them as they walked the streets. Nutmeg, they believed, was a miracle, a medicine, a status symbol, a spice from paradise. And the Bandanese had all of it, every single tree on Earth. It was the greatest accidental monopoly in human history, and it was about to be the deadliest. In 1511, a fleet of strange ships arrived at the Banda Islands. Pale men, in armor, with cannons and crosses. The Portuguese. They had spent decades searching for the source of nutmeg. They had crossed half the planet. They had killed and tortured and bribed their way through every port in Asia trying to find these islands. And finally, they found them. The Portuguese didn't conquer the Bandanese. Not at first. They tried to negotiate. They wanted a monopoly. They offered protection in exchange for exclusive trading rights. The Bandanese refused. These were independent people, proud merchants. They had traded freely for thousands of years, and they were not about to hand over their birthright to a bunch of pale-skinned strangers in iron suits. The Portuguese left, but they left something behind, something invisible, a whisper, a rumor that spread back through every European port, through Lisbon, through Venice, through Amsterdam. The Banda Islands exist. They're real. They have everything. and they're not protected. And in Amsterdam, a group of men were listening. Men with money, with ships, with guns, and with a level of ambition the world had never seen before. They called themselves the Dutch East India Company. And what they did to the Bandanese is one of the darkest stories in human history. A story you were never told. A story your textbook skipped. A story that ends in Manhattan. In 1602, the Dutch government did something no government had ever done before. They created a corporation with its own army, its own navy, its own currency, the power to declare war, the power to sign treaties, the power to execute prisoners, the power to govern entire territories. A company that was, in every way that mattered, a country. The Dutch East India Company, in their own language, the VOC. At its peak, the VOC was the most valuable company that has ever existed in all of human history. To give you context, if you adjust for inflation, the modern value of Apple is about $3 trillion. The modern value of Microsoft is about $3 trillion. The Dutch East India Company, at its peak, was worth $8 trillion. Bigger than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Facebook combined. And this company had one obsession, one target, one island chain they were willing to do anything to control: the Banda Islands. Because whoever controlled Banda controlled Nutmeg, and whoever controlled Nutmeg controlled the most profitable trade route on Earth. In 1609, the VOC sent their first expedition. They demanded the Bandanese sign a treaty, sell nutmeg only to the Dutch, forever. The Bandanese did what they always did. They smiled, they negotiated, they signed papers they didn't understand, and then they kept trading with everyone else. To them, it was normal commerce. To the Dutch, it was a violation, a betrayal. For 10 years, this dance continued. The VOC built forts. The Bandanese ignored them. The VOC sent merchants. The Bandanese sold to the English instead, and the Dutch grew impatient. Then, in 1621, they ran out of patience. And what happened next was not war, it was not conquest, it was extermination. The man the Dutch sent was named Jan Pieterszoon Coen. Remember that name, because in the Netherlands, until very recently, there were statues of him, streets named after him, schools that honored him as a national hero. Jan Pieterszoon Coen had a vision. He wrote it in a letter to the company, and I'm going to read you his exact words. He wrote, "The Bandanese problem must be solved by the complete extermination of all those who inhabit the islands. Not displacement, not punishment, extermination." In February of 1621, Coen arrived at the Banda Islands with 2,000 soldiers, plus a force of Japanese mercenaries, hired specifically for what was about to happen. Why Japanese? Because Coen wanted men who didn't speak the language, who couldn't be moved by pleas for mercy, who would do what he ordered, without hesitation. The Bandanese never had a chance. The Dutch landed at the largest island. They captured the leaders of the Bandanese, the village elders, the chiefs, the heads of the families, and they invited them to a peace negotiation inside the Dutch fort. 44 Bandanese leaders walked in. None of them walked out. The Japanese mercenaries executed them, all of them, inside the fort in a single afternoon. Then, they put the heads on poles, and they displayed them in the village squares of every Banda Island to send a message. But this was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, the Dutch hunted the rest of the Bandanese. They burned villages. They poisoned wells. They drove people into the mountains. Many threw themselves off cliffs rather than be captured. Of the 15,000 Bandanese who lived on those islands when the Dutch arrived, by the time it was over, only 1,000 were left alive. The other 14,000 were dead, or shipped off as slaves, or driven into the sea. An entire people, an entire civilization, an entire culture erased, in a matter of weeks, for a spice, for nutmeg. And here is the part that should make you feel sick. After it was over, Jan Pieterszoon Coen was not punished. He was not even criticized. The Dutch East India Company gave him a bonus. The Dutch government gave him a hero's welcome, and for the next 200 years, the Netherlands grew rich, spectacularly rich, beyond imagination rich, off a monopoly that was built on a graveyard. But there was one problem, one small island that the Dutch did not control, and that island was about to change the world. Of the 10 Banda Islands, the Dutch took 9, but one tiny island, only 2 miles long, half a mile wide, was held by someone else. It was called Run Island, and it was held by the British. In 1616, an English captain named Nathaniel Courthope had landed on Run Island with just a few dozen men. He raised the British flag, he made a deal with the local people, and he claimed the island for England. The Dutch were furious. For the next 4 years, Nathaniel Courthope held Run Island against the entire Dutch Navy. 2 ships, a handful of men, against the most powerful corporation on earth. The Dutch besieged him. They cut off his supplies. They tried to starve him out. They tried to bribe him. They tried to kill him. He refused to leave. Why? Because as long as Britain held Run Island, Britain had its own source of nutmeg. The Dutch monopoly was incomplete, and every pound of nutmeg the British smuggled out cost the Dutch a fortune. In 1620, Nathaniel Courthope was finally killed, shot in the head during a Dutch attack. But the British did not surrender Run Island. They held on for another 47 years, and the dispute over this single, tiny, 2-mile island became one of the longest-running diplomatic conflicts of the 17th century. By 1665, England and the Netherlands were at war, the second of 3 wars they would fight, in part, over nutmeg. The war went badly for the Dutch at first, then it went badly for the English, then it went badly for both. In 1667, exhausted, both sides agreed to negotiate. The treaty would be signed in a Dutch city called Breda, and what they decided there is the part of this story that changed the world. At the Treaty of Breda in 1667, the negotiators from both sides sat down with a map. The Dutch had captured a number of British territories during the war. The British had captured a number of Dutch territories, and one of those Dutch territories was a colony on the east coast of North America. A swampy island, a small trading post, a few hundred Dutch settlers and a fort. It was called New Amsterdam. The British had taken it from the Dutch 3 years earlier in 1664. They had renamed it after the brother of King Charles II, the Duke of York. They called it New York. Now, at the treaty table, the Dutch had a choice. They could demand New Amsterdam back. They could fight to reclaim their colony in North America. Or they could take something else. They could demand the one thing they had wanted for decades. The one thing they could not buy, could not steal, could not conquer. Run Island. The tiny Nutmeg Island, the last piece of the monopoly, the final 2-square-mile gap in their global empire of spice. The Dutch negotiators did not hesitate. They gave New York to the British, forever. In exchange, they got Run Island, a small piece of New York, for a small piece of nutmeg. And at the time, they believed they had won. Because nutmeg, at that exact moment in history, was the most valuable commodity on Earth. New York was a backwater, a swamp, a loss-making colony that nobody really wanted. But nutmeg was money in your hands, right now, today. The Dutch chose nutmeg. 100 years later, a Frenchman named Pierre Poivre stole some nutmeg seedlings from the Banda Islands. He smuggled them out. He planted them on Mauritius. They grew. Then someone took them to Grenada. They grew there too. By the early 1800s, nutmeg was growing everywhere. The Dutch monopoly was over. The price collapsed by 90%. The thing they killed 15,000 people for. The thing they traded New York for. The thing they built an empire on. Suddenly, it was just a spice. Today, a small bottle of nutmeg costs $3 at any grocery store. Today, Manhattan is worth over $2 trillion. Today, the Banda Islands are a forgotten corner of Indonesia where almost no one goes. Today, if you walk into any kitchen in the world, you can find nutmeg sitting in a rack, ignored, untouched, worth less than a cup of coffee. The Dutch made the worst trade in human history. But here's the thing nobody mentions. The reason you live in a world where America speaks English instead of Dutch, where New York is the financial capital of the planet instead of a forgotten European outpost, where the United States exists at all, is because of a small brown seed that the Dutch wanted more than they wanted a city. If they had chosen Manhattan in 1667, everything would be different. Every map, every border, every language, every president, every dollar. The entire course of the modern world was decided by a spice. So next time you reach for your spice rack and your fingers brush past that little jar of nutmeg, I want you to remember, you are touching the same thing that killed 15,000 people, the same thing the Dutch chose over New York City, the same thing the popes burned, the same thing kings wore around their necks. You are touching the thing that quite literally built the modern world. And nobody ever taught you, nobody told you, nobody mentioned it. Because the history we are taught is not the real history. The real history is hidden in the small things, in the kitchen drawer, in the spice rack, in the ordinary objects we never think about. This was Spice Lore. If this changed the way you see the world, hit subscribe. Because next week, we're telling a story that's even more insane. A story about a single flower that broke an entire economy. A flower so valuable, people sold their houses to buy it. A flower so dangerous, it caused the world's first financial crash. The story of tulip mania. Welcome to Spice Lore, the lore of the things you thought you knew.